Alright, we're back for part 2. We're going to talk a little bit about this, which is the stress response system. We talked a little bit about this when we talked about anxiety. Essentially what we're talking about here is that same fight or flight system that gets activated when you get exposed to something that you're scared of or that you're fearful of. So this is essentially in 3 phases. We have phase 1, which is the alarm phase, which is the sympathetic nervous system arousal. Something scares us, something frightens us, or causes us anxiety, and we have this alarm response. And if you remember, talking about that, some of the things that happen is your blood pressure starts to increase, we start to sweat, we start to have it can get shaky, some changes in our body as we prepare to either fight or run away from whatever we're fearful of. Phase 2 of this stress response is the resistance. Our body starts to mobilize, our brain starts to mobilize and help us cope with the stressor at hand. So this is after that initial phase where the fight or flight sympathetic nervous system is activated. This is the phase where you're actually doing something, trying to work through the stressor or deal with the situation. And then phase 3 is the exhaustion. This is caused by sort of chronic stress, where this alarm response and the resistance has gone on for longer than we would expect. Remember, what traditionally happens with the fight or flight is we get the sympathetic nervous system activated, and then when the feared item, say a person jumping out and trying to attack you, when that is over, our body goes back to its normal state. So the parasympathetic nervous system sort of activates and decreases that arousal level and brings us back to normal. In this situation, in this stress response, we have this exhaustion phase that kicks in, where that never happens. The decrease in arousal never happens the way it's supposed to, either because we have continued exposure to the stressor. Think people living in, we gave the example of people living through a hurricane that destroyed all of their property and homes and families' homes. So people who continue to live in that same environment, the stressor is still there. Or people who are in, say, a domestic violence situation or dealing with some sort of trauma. If they're still in the trauma, they kind of go through this exhaustion period where things aren't getting better, and the body stays at this heightened sense of arousal. And over a long period of time, that can be, it can cause a lot of problems. It can cause increased anxiety disorders, depression. It can even cause death. Ultimately, it causes death because your body can't stay at that activated state that long. So hopefully that makes sense. Just the basic biology of that. The stressor activates the autonomic nervous system, part of the sympathetic nervous system, and it essentially activates this HPA axis, which produces cortisol. And we know that cortisol is our stress hormone. Anytime you are, your body is stressed, you're producing large amounts of cortisol. And so the HPA is the stress response cycle, and that is largely a function of an operation that occurs in the hippocampus in the brain, part of our limbic system, and this HPA axis is very highly receptive to cortisol levels. The hippocampus helps to turn off that cycle and calm things down. But chronic stress can result in damage to that part of the brain. So it can cause the hippocampus to not be able to recognize when there is no current attack. It can cause the hippocampus to not be able to function in a way to turn that off. Think of it as a release valve. It doesn't turn on the release valve, and so the pressure just keeps continuing. And so even after the stressor is resolved, there's no calming down that occurs. We stay at this elevated state. And that's sort of what long-term stress does to the brain. It gets you accustomed to stress. You just plan on stress being a normal part of your life. And so the brain is constantly on guard, waiting for the next thing to occur. And it actually damages the brain in a way that makes it less likely that it's going to be able to turn things off or recognize the lack of stressor the next time around. So it becomes this loop where we get less efficient at turning on and off the stress response cycle, and as a result it just stays on all the time. So we stay under this great deal of stress, and it continues to create this terrible system in our body where we're constantly on edge and afraid of something happening. In some of the primate research, you see that high and low social status could be a factor. So high cortisol levels are associated with low social status, so people are isolated. And people who are depressed or highly anxious and maybe agoraphobic staying at home creates this high cortisol buildup in the body because of the lack of social support or social networking, which also creates that feedback loop as well. So lower social status have fewer lymphocytes and poorer immune systems. And in primates, dominant males benefit from predictability and controllability. But guess what? So does everybody. We know that predictability and controllability are two things that help us manage stress and anxiety. The more predictable a stressor is, the less likely it is to impact us negatively. So the more uncontrollable, the more unpredictable, the more likely it is to cause us stress. If you don't see it coming, you can't plan for it. So it's one of the things that's happened to us with the coronavirus. It isn't something we can really control. We thought we had a handle on things. We thought vaccines were going to be the cure-all. But here we are, almost a year later, we're in a situation where, half of our population is vaccinated, and it seems to be, we are indeed, again, at the height of positive cases. I spent, 3 days at home this week, quarantined because for fear of it. So it's one of those things that is part of our stress system now that's completely unpredictable. We have no idea what's going to happen. We can't control it. There's nothing I can do to affect the outcome. I can do things to help. I can take vaccines, not to get into political discussion or whatever, but we can take vaccines that are going to reduce our likelihood of dying from the disease, but it doesn't take away the stressors that are created by the virus and what it's done to us collectively as a culture. So, I think that's an example, excuse me, that is playing out. Hold on, pausing. Sorry, but it's an example that's playing out in front of all of us as we go about our daily lives. Everything is extremely unpredictable right now, and as a result, we have a lot of stressors that are related to this virus. Actually, I'm going to post some videos for you all. At least one video that talks about the chronic stress that's going on right now is tied to the virus and what we're all sort of living through. So, but I think it's a perfect example of where we are now. And predictability and controllability are very important. And we touched on this already, but vulnerabilities and mental illness can contribute to physical illness. So, just basic stress and, again, the perceived uncontrollability, the lack of ability to do anything about it. We can't do anything to affect change, not having any support. And then also, we talked about depression last week, like the negative affect, the feeling that I'm not good enough, the world's never going to get any better, things aren't going to improve, there's nothing I can do about it. So just the way we view the world also impacts how we deal with stress. And some people are just sort of naturally better at dealing with that than other people. And the interpretation of the physiological response, like anxiety, can also play a role too. We can notice that our hearts are starting to race, or we're starting to get sweaty, and that creates this panic in us, and it sort of stimulates that stress response. And again, that lack of controllability, feeling like you can't do anything about it, because one of the things that helps us deal with the stress response cycle is this idea of self-efficacy, that we can influence our own environment, that we can control our own environment and do things to improve our situation. So if you don't have that, you're more likely to land in a situation that leads you to chronic stress. Now I have this whole little thing over my face here, so just ignore that. We'll actually skip that altogether. Actually, yeah, let's pause there and we'll come back for part 2 or part 3.